Across the obsidian surface of the primary data slate, a thin layer of crystalline frost began to form. Security Overseer Cathis tapped the screen. The chamber's environmental readouts insisted the ambient temperature remained a perfectly calibrated standard 20 degrees. I wish I could tell you the council listened to her. But arrogance is a deafening thing. Stay close. At the center of the vast circular amphitheater sat the human envoy. That particular political designation, Cathis found extremely difficult to reconcile. 17 standard cycles old. Reigns wore a dense gray garment lacking any ceremonial medals, holographic prestige markers, or house insignias. Woven directly into the dull fabric were thick metallic threads, resembling primitive blast padding used by deep-shaft miners. She held a cylindrical vessel in her left hand. Condensation beaded on the exterior of the simple container, catching the harsh emerald light of the overhead illuminators. A single glass of liquid water. To offer raw, unpurified fluid was a gesture Cathis recognized exclusively from the impoverished outer colonies. The act signaled complete subjection, a desperate offering of her own basic sustenance to the towering high delegates gathered to determine her world's fate. Proved Earth possessed nothing of true value. From the northern dais, High Delegate Vorith dominated the visual field. Polished gold filigree, his hardened carapace displayed with deliberate pride. He leaned forward, grinding the heavy ceremonial plates of his armor together. The resulting friction produced a low, guttural screech that mimicked tectonic plates colliding under intense pressure. Cathis monitored the tension spikes on his localized biometric sensors. The surrounding alien representatives projected aggressive pheromones, a thick chemical soup of dominance meant to overwhelm any mammalian olfactory system. High above the arena floor, 20 different apex species sat in curved, elevated tiers. Cathis watched the drawn emissaries whisper among themselves, their secondary eyelids flicking rapidly with predatory amusement. A Kalan delegate sharpened a metallic talon against the stone railing, sending a high-pitched scrape echoing through the acoustic dampeners. Every architectural line in the vaulted chamber was specifically engineered to funnel psychological pressure downward, physically isolating and crushing whoever stood at the central focal point. Yet, the human youth remained entirely stationary within the hostile atmosphere. She did not tremble, nor did her resting heart rate fluctuate on the security feeds. Her pale eyes tracked Vorith's aggressive posturing without widening, holding an expression of blank, unnerving calm. Against the smooth edge of the water vessel, her index finger maintained a continuous, rhythmic cadence. Tap, tap, tap. Cathis documented the repetitive motion as an involuntary nervous tic, a minor physiological leak of the terror she actively suppressed. He initiated a secondary deep tissue scan of the envoy. The diagnostic beam swept invisibly over the teenager. No subdermal explosives registered on the display. No neural transmitters. No concealed plasma emitters. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a biological vulnerability wrapped in woven fibers. And yet, the anomaly persisted. The ambient temperature around the human's immediate perimeter continued a microscopic, steady decline. The cold wasn't merely ambient. It possessed a biting, aggressive quality that gnawed at the joints of Cathis's exoskeleton. He rubbed his primary manipulators together. A distinct chill had entered the air intake vents directly above his station, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of ionized ozone. He checked the orbital trajectory of her transport again. The human ship parked beyond the station's perimeter was a decommissioned hauler, stripped of all military plating. It radiated barely enough thermal energy to maintain standard life support for a single occupant. It made absolutely no logical sense. Your species claims the Orion span. Vorith's voice boomed against the vaulted ceiling, demanding absolute silence from the gallery. Earth claims nothing. Reigns answered immediately, her vocal tone entirely devoid of standard inflection. We hold the territorial lines established during the third cycle. We offer this element as a formal renewal. She nudged the glass exactly 2 centimeters forward across the black stone. A puddle of moisture. Vorith scoffed, a wet sound originating deep within his thorax, snapping his lower mandibles in a sharp click of utter dismissal. You bring no tithe of processed deuterium, no localized orbital schematics, and no fleet registry. Your dying world sends a larva to beg for border leniency with a cup of rain. Into the mounting hostility, Rains pushed the offering another centimeter. Her breathing remained perfectly even. One deep inhalation drew through her nose, expelling slowly through slightly parted lips. Cathis adjusted his optical filters. The ice crystals on his monitoring slate had thickened, completely obscuring the translated text. Why was the thermal regulation failing only near the central podium? He keyed a silent diagnostic protocol into the secure network. The central mainframe returned a negative error code, confirming all grid nodes operated at peak efficiency. "Return to your fragile dirt," Vorith declared, standing to his full 3-meter height and casting a long shadow over the podium. "The High Council formally revokes the Orion span boundaries. Our heavy extraction fleets depart at the next orbital rotation." That pronouncement finalized the diplomatic death sentence. The fragile peace accord shattered, officially rendering Earth's outer colonies defenseless against corporate strip mining. Cathis braced for the inevitable breakdown. He expected the human to weep, to plead, or to exhibit the chaotic emotional fragility typical of unarmored mammals facing imminent catastrophic loss. Instead, Rains simply stopped tapping the glass. She tilted her head slightly to the left. Vorith delivered his final gesture of absolute contempt. A heavy, armored forearm swept across the central podium in a brutal, dismissive arc. The glass cylinder shattered against the floor with a sharp crack that cut through the assembly's low hum. Across the polished black stone, the liquid spilled, pooling in the decorative grooves of the dais. The council guards immediately unholstered their kinetic suppressors. 6 armored enforcers stepped forward in perfect unison, their weapons angling downward to escort the failed envoy to the outbound hangar bays. From his elevated observation post, Cathis finalized the formal entry in his security logs. The treaty was officially dead. The Orion span lay legally forfeited. Satisfied with his absolute political victory, the High Delegate turned his massive back to the center floor. Vorith paused a moment to adjust the heavy velvet of his ceremonial sash. He ran a single, thick claw along his golden filigree, ensuring his primary rank insignias caught the emerald lighting at the optimal angle. He exhaled a long, rumbling breath, preparing to call the next agenda item. Fell the silence. Not a diplomatic pause, but a violent, physical absence of sound. The catastrophic atmospheric failure no perimeter alarm had predicted. Deep within the station's structural framework, the primary air scrubbers violently seized. A groaning, metallic shudder tore through the orbital platform. Instantly, the chamber's internal climate inverted. The ambient temperature plummeted past the threshold of biological sustainability in a matter of seconds. -30 degrees standard. Airborne humidity crystallized into jagged microshards, raining down upon the assembly like abrasive, glittering sand. Frost instantly blinded Cathis's optical surveillance lenses, forcing him to rely on raw visual processing. Vorith's boastful, towering posture collapsed immediately. A sharp, localized cracking noise echoed outward from his chest plates as the sudden violent thermal shock fractured his ornate carapace. Around the massive gallery, apex predators succumbed rapidly to basic thermodynamics. The drawn delegates slumped sideways against their gilded railings, their cold-blooded metabolic engines entering forced, emergency hibernation. Cyan fluid leaked from the Kalan representative spiracles, freezing solid before the droplets could strike the ground. The aggressive, dominant pheromones that had saturated the room evaporated completely. Replacing them came the sharp, acidic stench of systemic organ failure and raw biological terror. Through the freezing, swirling mist, Rain stood perfectly immobile. The dull gray fabric of her garments emitted a faint, deep red luminescence. The primitive padding Cathis had dismissed was a military-grade thermal weave, activating instantly to retain her core temperature. She exhaled a long, controlled plume of white vapor. Her rhythmic tapping had ceased exactly 1 second before the scrubbers failed. Beyond the grand panoramic viewports, the local star abruptly disappeared. 500 spatial displacement ruptures tore the vacuum apart simultaneously. Out of the violent purple tears emerged the angular, heavily scarred silhouettes of Earth's hidden armada. Leviathan-class dreadnoughts, stripped of all aesthetic design and built purely for planetary siege, blotted out the entire orbital horizon. Their collective mass was so immense it generated a secondary gravity well, physically dragging loose station debris toward their gunmetal hulls. Hundreds of red targeting lasers pierced the vacuum, painting the council chamber windows in a grid of lethal geometry. The balance of power shifted in a single terrifying heartbeat. Down in the lower scribe pits, Junior Scribe Vale dropped to his knees. Barely 6 cycles old, the young alien lacked the thickened thermal plating of the elder delegates. His slender, blue-scaled fingers shook violently against the freezing stone floor, as the vast, impenetrable shadows of the human dreadnoughts completely eclipsed his workstation. He gripped his crystalline datapad in absolute panic. The fragile device shattered under his desperate pressure, driving crystalline splinters deep into his trembling palms. "We brought water," Rain said. The acoustic dampeners had frozen solid inside the walls, allowing her raw, unmodified voice to echo sharply off the vaulted ceiling. "Not weapons. You chose the wrong one to spill." The realization struck Cathis with more force than the plunging temperature. That single glass Vorith had fundamentally misjudged. It was never a pathetic tithe from an impoverished world. It was a rigid, binary psychological test. Earth had offered the most fundamental element of biological survival. By deliberately rejecting the water, Vorith had formally documented the Council's absolute hostility on the galactic record. They had not dismissed a weak beggar. They had confidently and publicly failed a survival threshold. Humanity did not offer peace because they lacked the capacity for violence. They offered it because their capacity for violence was absolute. The Council had just officially authorized their own annihilation. Without looking back at the dying assembly, the human turned toward the heavy exit doors. The heavily armed security escort lay entirely immobilized on the frosted floor. Outside the reinforced glass, the 500 dreadnoughts maintained a stationary, completely silent orbit. On the black stone of the central podium, the spilled liquid no longer moved. The spilled water had flash-frozen into a jagged, permanent scar of solid ice.